In this lecture, there are a few objectives. We try to use the previous criteria that we've learned to evaluate whether and to what extent are monopolies desirable in terms of efficiency, equity, and consumer choice. And we will also be introduced to the idea that market dominance can cause under-allocation of resources to the production of certain good in markets where competition is imperfect and hence causing market failure. We also explore the idea of contestability of the market and see how it affects the desirability of monopolies. Finally, because we conclude that monopolies markets are actually not so desirable, we'll look at the various government control measures over monopolies to make them more desirable in terms of behavior. So, an essential question we'll be exploring is to what extent are monopolies desirable based on efficiency, equity, and availability of consumer choice. Okay, let's start with whether monopolies are productively efficient. So recall that we were introduced to 5 criteria for evaluation, what we call the PEDEC. Let's start with productive efficiency, P. So try to recall, do you still remember how to qualify or how can firms do so that they are productively efficient? There are 2 perspectives, right? From the firm's point of view and the society's point of view. From the firm's point of view, they must produce on the LISC curve. Why on the LISC curve? Because the LISC curve represents the lowest possible cost of production associated at a given output. So if they are producing on the LISC curve, it suggests that the firm is employing the least costly possible method of production. So it concerns the way firms produce such that their cost of production is minimized. Then, from the society's point of view, they would have to produce at the minimum point of the LIC curve, in other words, the minimum efficient scale. So the society would be concerned whether the firm is producing at a certain scale of production. Okay, it's no longer about the method of production, but about how much they are producing, such that they are um, minimizing the cost to be the lowest possible. Okay, so let's illustrate the monopolist output and price decision. So we know that it will produce a profit maximizing output of Q because that's where the marginal revenue will be equivalent to its marginal cost. And at output of Q, the firm can charge a price of P as given by the downward sloping demand curve. And we need to make an assumption about whether there is X inefficiency in the monopolist firm due to market contestability or lack of market contestability. So, what is X inefficiency? Well, it is a situation where the firm finds no incentive to minimize its cost because it faces no competition. It can exercise extensive market power, and therefore, there is no pressure for it to keep costs low, and it will still continue to make supernormal profits. So if we assume that there is no X inefficiency due to the market being very contestable, meaning the firm faces real threat of a new competitor coming into the market, and therefore, as a result of this threat and or market contestability, it has incentive to minimize its cost and it does not suffer from X inefficiency. As a result, what do you expect the average cost of production of the firm to be at output Q? Well, it will be on the LIC curve, which is the minimum possible cost of production at Q, right? It will be at C. So if this is true, then we can say that a firm is productively efficient from the firm's point of view because it is producing on the LIC curve, which is the minimum possible cost of production at this output that it is producing at. However, this may not be true if we assume that there is X inefficiency. In other words, the firm is complacent. The monopolist firm is complacent because of lack of competition. And when the market is not contestable, meaning it does not face existing competition and also it does not face any credible threat of competitors coming into the market to challenge its market power. And therefore, as a result, it has no incentive at all to minimize its cost of production. And we will not expect its cost of production to be at C, but somewhere higher, perhaps at C prime. So in that case, its cost of production is no longer on the LIAC curve, and therefore the firm will not be considered productively efficient from the firm's point of view. In conclusion, whether a monopolist is productively efficient depends on whether the market is contestable. So we see how contestability of the market affects desirability of the firm in terms of whether it is productively efficient from the firm's point of view. It is actually more likely that the monopolist is X inefficient given how little competition it faces. And if we assume that the market is not contestable, then it is likely that it will be X inefficient and therefore productively inefficient from the firm's perspective. You may want to check that because previously you were introduced to PC firms where PC firms are said to be productively efficient, you may ask the question, how are we sure that PC firms are actually producing on the LIAC curve and not above the LIAC curve, right? So let's explore this question. So this would be the output decision of the PC firm. It will produce at Q as the profit maximizing output, as this is where MC is MC equals to MR, and it charges a price of P as given by the market. Okay, so the question is, how are we sure that its cost of production is at the minimum point of the LIAC curve or on the LIAC curve and not above it? Well, what do we know about PC firms? They are price takers, so they charge a price of P. And in order to avoid making a loss, in other words, subnormal profit, the PC firms would have to minimize their costs so that the average cost is also equivalent to the price it charges, right? It cannot lower its average cost further to below the cost of P, okay, to further down, because the LIAC curve represents the lowest possible cost of production at all possible output level, right? It cannot go below the LIAC curve, right? So the minimum cost it can do is at a cost of P. Okay, so that is also the position where it breaks even and make a normal profit. So what if it cannot minimize its cost and it actually produces at a cost which is higher than P? Well, then it will make a subnormal profit, right? So let's say it produced at a cost of C prime. Then it will make a subnormal profit because C prime will be more than the price it receives and therefore exit the market in the long run because it will not be able to break even and survive in the market due to the subnormal profit. Okay, so in other words, the PC firms all have to face intense competition due to the numerous number of firms all selling homogeneous product, and therefore no PC firm would be able to survive unless it keeps its cost to the minimum at the same level as the price P. Okay, so because of this constraint, PC firms are by default productively efficient. Okay, so let's come back to the case of monopolist firm. We said that it is productively inefficient if it suffers from X inefficiency from the firm's point of view, right? So what about from the society's point of view? Well, from a society's point of view, it has to produce at the minimum point of the LIAC curve, which in this case would be at Q prime. However, the profit maximizing monopolist will be producing at Q, which is less than Q prime. So it is not productively efficient also from the society's point of view because it is producing less than Q prime. Okay, because the monopolist obviously will be profit maximizing, that's why it produces at Q, and it is less than the MES scale of production or the output level that will minimize its cost. So we say that the firm, the monopolist, is not utilizing its full capacity and they're producing with excess capacity. In other words, the monopolist can increase its output to Q prime and exploit the internal economies of scale and further reduce or minimize its cost of production. But it is not doing so because of profit maximizing objective. So to the society, there is underutilization of resources. there is underutilization of resources, and later in another segment, we'll explain how this could be a source of market failure, right? So there will be under allocation of resources in the production of this good, whatever good that we are talking about in this market, right? Because the optimal level of output produced will be more than Q, okay? But that's for another segment. So the conclusion will be that the monopolist is not productively efficient from the society's and the firm's point of view if we assume that there is X inefficiency. Okay, now let's move on to allocative efficiency.